On the 11th of December 1936, a man spoke on the BBC. Millions of listeners held their breath as he announced his resolve to go forward with a decision which was, and remains, unique in British history: his abdication of the throne. That man was Edward VIII. The reason behind his abdication was his love for a woman that the British court and the establishment would have never accepted as queen: the American, twice divorced Wallis Simpson. In today's Biographics, we're going to present their story, one of frustration, unhappy marriages, and fraught relationships. The story of how a man and a woman renounced the British crown, apparently for love, and of how they were tempted to reclaim the throne by the machinations of their supposed enemy, the Third Reich. Edward was born on the 23rd of June 1894 in Richmond, Surrey. He was the eldest child of the future King George V, the grandchild to King Edward VII, and a great-grandchild of Queen Victoria, who was still alive at the time of his birth. He was always known in the family as David, the last of his many middle names. From his youth, Edward was set on a naval career. However, the quick ascension to the throne of his father, George V, in 1910 meant that Edward was immediately appointed Prince of Wales on his 16th birthday. Edward had to quit his naval studies and enrolled at Oxford. It's generally agreed that Edward was intellectually underwhelming, or maybe just not that interested in studying. Besides a good performance with his polo team at Oxford, he had little academic achievement and left university after 8 terms with no degree. At the outbreak of World War I, Edward joined the Grenadier Guards. The young prince was keen to see action on the Western Front, like his rival, counterpart, and relative, German Crown Prince Wilhelm. However, the British government forbade this for risk of losing the heir to the throne. After the war, in January 1919, Edward's youngest brother, the Prince John, died at age 13. After a long struggle with epilepsy, the young prince had succumbed to a seizure. On this occasion, Edward referred to John's death as little more than a regrettable nuisance. His contacts with John were so limited due to his illness that he remembered him as more of an animal than anything else. Edward had to write a letter to his mother apologizing for being such a cold-hearted and unsympathetic swine. Throughout the 1920s, Edward undertook extensive foreign tours, particularly in the British Empire, representing his father. Edward also took to visiting areas of high unemployment and deprivation in Britain during the economic depression of the early 1930s. These occasions made him familiar and popular with the press and the public. His image at this stage was that of a dashing dandy, good-looking, well-dressed, skilled at playing polo and flying airplanes. He had earned a pilot's license in 1918 and was the first British monarch to ever fly an aircraft. In the 1920s, Edward also dedicated time to another passion. He had a string of affairs with several married women, which cemented his status as the world's most desirable bachelor. At the same time, his affairs seemed to keep him from fulfilling one of his duties as Prince of Wales: finding a suitable match. In late 1930, Edward had started a relationship with Thelma, Viscountess Furness, also married at the time. It was Thelma who, probably in January 1931, introduced him to a beautiful, intelligent, and witty American friend, Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson was born Bessie Wallace Warfield on the 19th of June 1896 in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. This was a spa town where her father, Teakle Wallace, was seeking treatment for tuberculosis, which unfortunately claimed his life when Bessie was only a few months old. Bessie's mother was an impoverished widow, but fortunately she was taken in by Solomon, her late husband's rich brother, living in Baltimore. Solomon also paid for Bessie Wallace's education at an exclusive all-girl private school. As a teenager in Baltimore, Wallace dropped the Bessie and was subjected to many girlhood passions. She fell madly in love with 2 teachers and several girlfriends and sent them letters describing them as beautiful little partridges. There is no proof that she actually had any homosexual relationships, though. After graduating, Wallace dated many handsome men despite not being well off nor especially good looking by the standards of that time. In 1916, Wallace married an airman called Wynne Spencer. The marriage, it was not a happy one, though. When Wynne tried to kiss her on their wedding night, Wallace recoiled. Later, she asserted that the marriage was never consummated. This marriage It was really doomed to failure. Wynne was transferred to China, where their relationship eventually broke down because of Wynne's alcoholism and sadism. Wallis left the household and went to live with her friend Catherine and her husband Herman Rogers. Herman was not just a friend, though. Wallis considered him to be the true love of her life. However, according to her biographer Andrew Morton, this relationship also never evolved into a sexual one. Later, she met a South American man, Felipe Espil, who also undoubtedly became the true love of Wallis's life, though she never definitively had sex with him either. Wallis then moved to England, where she married Anglo-American businessman Ernest Simpson. Ernest may not have shared Wynne's alcoholism nor sadism, but also this second marriage was a platonic relationship. Again, this is Wallis's own version, as reported by Morton. In London, Wallis became friends with Thelma, Viscountess Furness, who introduced her to Edward. From then on, Wallis became a regular presence of the royal social scene, and she started to receive letters signed simply PW for Prince of Wales. When the affair between Thelma and the Prince of Wales came to an end, Wallis took her friend's place. Very early in the relationship, Wallis became indispensable to his household. She organized his dinner parties and went on exotic foreign holidays with him. Royal courtiers were not openly hostile at this stage, yet they were wary of Wallis's hold on the prince. Again, evidence suggests that their relationship was not of a physical nature, and there are questions about the true nature of their attraction. But Edward soon had to face reality. On the 29th of January 1936, George VI died after a prolonged illness. It was time for his accession to the throne. The new king did not have any intention to interrupt his love story with Wallis, and the two continued to be seen together at official occasions, such as the proclamation of his own accession. At this stage, their affair was not widely known to the public, as the British establishment did their best to hush up the whole story. But members of high society had started spreading stories which made their way to the US and to other countries. Readers abroad started to collect news clippings from gossip columns and post them to relatives in the UK. In other cases, foreign magazines carrying the news were sold in London. An article from the Milwaukee Journal, dated the 30th of October 1936, tells of how American newspapers were mysteriously removed from newsstands in central London. Sometimes just a selection of pages had been ripped out. After a while, the whole world seemed to be in on the story, except for the British press, who feigned ignorance or just chose to ignore the affair. When Wallis finally divorced her husband, it meant that she and Edward were one step closer to marrying. But this was covered by a single article at the bottom of page 10 in The Guardian. The story of the affair between the king and a twice-divorced American finally exploded in December of 1936, when Bishop Blunt of Bradford denounced the couple from his pulpit. With the cat out of the bag and with Wallis's divorce out of the way, a word started to make the rounds amongst the British cabinet of ministers, and that word was abdication. As King of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Edward was also the head of the Church of England. At that time, the church did not allow for divorced people to remarry unless their former spouse was already dead. So could the head of the Anglican faith violate one of the tenets for his own church? For this reason, the cabinet feared that the British people would never accept Wallis as queen. Edward had to choose, either Wallis or the crown. But actually, at the beginning, he tried to negotiate with the cabinet. He had already proposed the idea of a morganatic marriage to Prime Minister Baldwin in November of 1936. A morganatic marriage would leave Edward on the throne, assign to Wallis a lesser title instead of queen, and would have revoked the rights of succession to any offspring. When Baldwin rejected the proposal, Edward had only one option left: On the 10th of December 1936, King Edward VIII submitted his abdication to the government, which was endorsed by Parliament on the very next day. He had become the only British monarch to ever resign voluntarily. His brother, Albert, Duke of York, would rise to the throne as King George VI. On the 11th of December, the now former king announced his decision to the nation on the radio. This part was true, although at the time few believed Edward's words. Wallis was horrified at the idea that Edward would abdicate for her and tried to talk him out of it. Theirs had only been an affair and not real love. Wallis was still in love with Felipe and with Herman. But once the abdication was announced, she felt obliged to go through with the charade and marry Edward, now styled the Duke of Windsor. Biographer Andrew Morton reveals that on the day of the wedding she begged Herman, her one true love, to get her pregnant. This would not have been possible, as a previous surgical operation had left Wallis incapable of conceiving. In any case, Herman refused her proposal. Edward and Wallis married on the 3rd of June 1937 at the Château de Cannes near Tours in France. A Guardian article from that time reports that Herman Rogers was much present at the ceremony. He played host to the groom, walked Wallis to the altar, and even delivered an address to the press on behalf of Edward, asking for the couple's privacy to be respected. Based on what we know today about Wallis and Herman, the whole wedding must have felt incredibly awkward for these two souls. In any case, the marriage was sealed, and the newlyweds left for a 3-month honeymoon in Austria. Yet again, based on Morton's accounts, also Wallis's third marriage remained unconsummated. For the following 2 years, Wallis and Edward, or the Windsors, lived mainly in France. The relationships between them and the royal family were severely strained. Edward was furious at George VI for refusing to style Wallis as Her Royal Highness. On the other hand, George forbade his brother to return to Britain, lest he rescind his generous allowance. The relationship with the court and with the cabinet worsened when the Windsors visited Germany in October of 1937. The official reason for the visit was for Edward to learn more about the regime's employment and housing policies. In truth, Edward was craving a princely treatment, especially for Wallis, and knew that the German leadership were all too keen to roll out the red carpet. In addition to that, he saw himself as a mediator between Britain and Germany. During their visit, the Windsors met with Goering, Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, Goebbels, Himmler, and Rudolf Hess. They even spent 2 hours with the Führer, and the Duke was photographed delivering a Nazi salute. The British government, they saw this as a bit of an embarrassment. 2 years after the declaration of war on Germany, Edward was appointed liaison officer to the French army. When the Germans finally invaded in May of 1940, the Windsors escaped to southern France, and then they went on to neutral Spain and finally to Portugal in July. New Prime Minister Winston Churchill was keen to get the Windsors back to Britain as soon as possible, but the Duke delayed proceedings as he wanted to negotiate a post befitting to his rank and simple courtesies for Wallis. Meanwhile, the Germans were conspiring to get a hold of the Windsors. In their plan, should the invasion of Britain succeed, Edward would have made a good collaborationist king. Their theory was confirmed by the intelligence reports flying in from Madrid and Lisbon, according to which Windsor spoke strongly against Churchill and against this war, and that the Duke was convinced that had he remained on the throne, war would have been avoided, and describes himself as a firm supporter of peaceful compromise with Germany. The telegram from Lisbon continued with a sinister note: "The Duke believes with certainty that continued heavy bombing will make England ready for peace." A certain show about the royal family builds on this idea that Edward may have inspired the carpet bombing of civilian targets in Britain. This has not been verified, and surely the Luftwaffe did not need this passing comment to inspire their strategic plans. What we can say with more certainty, though, is that Edward was potentially pro-Nazi and still believed in the 1930s politics of appeasement, and was a defeatist, to say the least. Churchill was aware of the danger of the Duke's declarations, and so issued orders to keep an eye on him, lest he speak against the Allied war effort to the press. He even sent him a direct warning, ordering him not to mention any view about the war or about the Germans or about Hitlerism which is different from that adopted by the British nation and Parliament. But the Duke's delaying tactics, they continued. Churchill's ultimate solution was to get the Duke as far away from Europe as possible by appointing him governor of the Bahamas. But Edward refused, claiming the Bahamas to be a third-class British colony, and considered returning to Spain as Franco's guest instead. Von Ribbentrop took advantage of the stalling situation and sent an explicit offer to the Windsors. Germany is determined to force England to peace by every means of power, and upon this happening would be prepared to accommodate any desire expressed by the Duke, especially with a view to the assumption of the English throne by the Duke and Duchess. The offer did not solicit an immediate agreement, but neither a flat-out rejection. A German agent reported that the Duchess appeared to be considering this proposal very thoughtfully. But this was not enough for Berlin. The Germans needed to take the Windsors back to Madrid to better control them, and so they launched a secret operation codenamed Willy to ensure that the Duke bent to their will. The head of Nazi counterintelligence, Walter Schellenberg, traveled to Lisbon to oversee the simple plan. It involved a threatening message relayed by Miguel Primo de Rivera, a Spanish nationalist very close to Franco. De Rivera informed the Windsors that they had uncovered a British plot to murder them and urged them to seek Spain's protection. Eventually, Plan Willy failed. Winston Churchill threatened the Duke with a court-martial if he refused to accept the post in the Bahamas. Edward was, after all, a Major General of the army and subject to military justice. The Windsors eventually left for the Bahamas on the 1st of August 1940. The Duke may still have been wary of the warnings from de Rivera, so he demanded protection from Scotland Yard. Edward had been physically removed from the war in Europe, but he still managed to score more embarrassing situations. In late 1940, for example, when interviewed by an American magazine, he said, "There will be no revolution in Germany, and it would be a tragic thing for the world if Hitler were to be overthrown. Hitler is the right and logical leader of the German people. Hitler is a very great man." As a governor of the Bahamas, Edward disliked the job, but he did some good work there. The Duke launched initiatives to raise wages for Bahamians and promoted plans to relieve poverty. But true to character, he could not help yet another faux pas. As he addressed these social problems, he blamed them on men of Central European Jewish descent who had secured jobs as a pretext for obtaining a deferment of draft. Full reports on the whole relationship between the Windsors and Nazi Germany were collected after the war in the so-called Windsor File. Most of it, however, remains classified, and for the moment we will not know the full extent of the Duke's sympathy or even collaboration with the regime. What we have are his public declarations and his interviews. In the 1950s, he blamed World War II on anti-appeasement politicians in Britain, Roosevelt, and the Jews. In 1966, he told an American newspaper he believed the UK should not have intervened. He stated, "I thought the rest of us could be fence-sitters while the Nazis and the Reds slogged it out." And privately, he expressed the view that, "I never thought Hitler was such a bad chap." After the war, the Windsors lived between the US and France. On the outside, it appeared as if Wallace and the former king lived a happy life of leisure thanks to the allowance that was still granted to them. But the reality was not as it seemed, as Andrew Morton has uncovered by reviewing Wallace's letters. Edward was always besotted, completely infatuated with her. Wallace always treated him with deference and respect, at least in public. She always referred to him as the Duke and called him Sir in public, but in private things were very different. She spent her days being unpleasant to all those around her and treated them with harsh coldness, especially her husband, to whom she denied any intimate contact. He would often say to her, "Am I going to bed in tears again tonight?" According to Morton, all they shared in later life was a mutual interest in golf, fascism, and casual racism. Wallace never forgot her first true loves for Felipe, but also for Herman. Many of the letters uncovered by Morton, in fact, are addressed to him. When Herman and Felipe died, Wallace was devastated and she retreated from the world, paying little attention to her husband. Edward paid only short visits to Britain after the war, mainly to attend funerals of family members. His relationship with the royal family remained strained and distant. His health deteriorated, and in the early 1970s, Edward was diagnosed with throat cancer. During his dying moment on the 28th of May 1972, the former king was being comforted by a nurse. With his last breath, he whispered, "Wallace, Wallace, and Wallace." But Wallace was not there. Edward died in the arms of a stranger rather than the woman for whom he had abdicated. After the Duke's death, Wallace settled in Paris. Once a known socialite, described as one of the best-dressed women in the world, Wallace retreated from the world and stopped entertaining. She died of coronary heart disease on the 24th of April 1986. Without any heirs nor relatives, she left her estate to the Pasteur Research Institute. And so ends one of the saddest personal stories of the 20th century. As Wallace and Edward's lives have been told on film many times, I'm not going to ask you to suggest a cast for yet another biopic film, but rather ask you to consider this. Considering what we know about Edward's pro-appeasement and potentially pro-Nazi stance, what would have happened if he had not abdicated? Could an extended reign of Edward VIII have changed the course of history? How would have World War II played out in such a scenario? Well, please post your alternate histories in the comments, and as usual, thank you for watching.